Hello and welcome to Business Daily from the BBC. I'm Manuela Zaragoza. Coming up in this edition, should the rich be taxed more? It's the big question of the moment amid growing concern over inequality everywhere. We'll hear from both sides of the argument here in Business Daily from the BBC. The Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, author of the book Utopia for Realists, thinks the rich have it easy when it comes to taxation. He said as much a couple of weeks ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and a recording of his comments went viral on social media with millions of views across the world. Here's a reminder of what he said.
I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more. But come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is in my opinion.
Thank you.
Why did Rutger Bregman's comments strike such a chord? Well, one of the reasons may be that taxation is a big issue in the US at the moment. Candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination there are in an apparent contest to determine who wants to tax the rich the most. There have been proposals for estate taxes, to double the top income tax rate, to roll back the tax changes President Trump has made. And the US Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has now formally launched her bid to stand for the White House in 2020, wants to tackle inequality through a wealth tax. She told the American news network MSNBC how it would work.
So the way that this is written is to say, first of all, going to tax all your assets wherever located around the globe. So if you were planning to move them to Switzerland or some island, doesn't make any difference. They are all going to be taxed. And you're going to have to pay, if you have more than $50 million in assets, this is the ultra rich, you're going to have to pay 2% a year of that amount over $50 million.
That was Senator Elizabeth Warren there speaking on MSNBC in the US. Taxation is hugely divisive. To show you just how divisive, we invited two people on opposite sides of the debate. The Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, who you heard from earlier in the clip from the World Economic Forum in Davos. He thinks the rich should be taxed way more. And Ed Conard, a visiting scholar with the Washington-based conservative research group, the American Enterprise Institute, and author of the counterintuitively titled The Upside of Inequality. Ed thinks high taxes stifle innovation and therefore cap economic growth. Ed first.
We all want the same thing, which is to get the most talented people to train properly, work hard, and take the risks that produce the innovation that grows the economy and increases prosperity for all of us. And so I think the only thing we really disagree about is what price does it take to get those people to work as hard as we possibly can and take as much risk as we can possibly get them to take. And I would just say, look at a comparison between the United States and Europe. Despite the fact that America has much lower test scores than Europe, the middle class
academically?
Incomes, academically, yes. The median household incomes are 15 to 30% higher. And the question is, why are they higher? And I think the answer is quite obvious. If you look at institutions in America like Google and Facebook, our talented workforce is much more productive than their counterparts in anywhere else in the world. And so why is that? Well, what we find is that our talented Americans take a lot more entrepreneurial risk and by some measures produce 7 times as much innovation as their counterparts in Europe. The experiment that's been run by the United States and Europe shows clearly that the higher the payoffs, the more risk-taking we get from our talent. And if we tax that payoff, we'll get less.
Rutger, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, where do I even begin? Is the United States a better place to live than Northern Europe? I would say that the evidence massively points in the other direction, you know, whether you talk about health or about education or just general levels of happiness or inequality. In so many ways, the Nordic welfare states or, you know, Holland, where I'm from, are doing a way better job and still being very innovative. Now, what historians call the golden age of capitalism, that was during the 50s and the 60s, was also a period in which we had relatively high taxes on marginal income, on wealth, on inheritances. And this was also the period when we actually put a man on the moon, you know, when we were much more innovative and we had higher growth rates than we have now. So I think that history shows us clearly that higher taxes do not discourage innovation. Actually, in many cases, the opposite is true.
I think one thing that you forget is that Scandinavia, for example, has twice the number of high scores as America and half the number of low scores as America.
On what, sorry?
On academic test scores. And so there's going to be a wide disparity. But even with those differences, America still is more prosperous than Northern Europe is. And when you take Scandinavians and
according to GDP, GDP is like the worst measure of prosperity out there. I mean,
let me ask Ed, which measure are you looking at when you?
I'm looking at things like GDP because as economists, it's one of the things we can measure simply. But I'll try to give you other measures as well, and we can laugh at that. But Scandinavians come to America, they earn 60% more than they do relative to their counterparts in Scandinavia. So for whatever reason, they choose to work a lot harder once they get here, which is exactly what we want from our most talented people. Another measure would be this. If you look at $1 billion unicorns, these are $1 billion startups valued at $1 billion, the United States is producing about 7 times as many of those as Europe is, despite the fact that it has, on a per capita basis, half the amount of talent. The other thing I would say is if we go back to the 1950s, yes, the marginal tax rates were very high, but we also destroyed the world with the Second World War and suffered through the Great Depression before that. So we had 2 decades of pent-up opportunities that had not been realized. Now, we can say things like GDP and don't matter, but if we turn to things like world poverty and say, what has been the change in world poverty? What's been the change in children who are malnutrition, of mothers who have died? We see extraordinary progress since the 1980s and 1990s.
I mean, the U.S. is in a very bad shape. I mean, I don't want to make this into a battle between Europe and the U.S., but for some groups, life expectancy is actually going down. So I think you're simply counting the wrong thing, sir. You're talking about GDP growth, but most people have experienced in the past couple of decades that they haven't seen any progress, and in many ways, things are getting worse for them.
Ed, what is the point of having economic growth if most people seem to think that they're missing out?
Well, I think the point is to get the maximum amount of value for the middle and working class. I think we want to put our talent to work.
How do you measure that value?
I would measure it as best we can. So an example of that would be incomes. I think what's even more important is incomes relative to your test score, because we know that people with high test scores versus low test scores are going to have very different incomes. We could look at how many square feet people live in, whether they have air conditioning, whether they're driving cars. And it is not true that U.S. incomes haven't grown. It's true that that was a study that was done a while back, but the study's been redone with proper data, and everybody agrees median incomes and working class incomes have risen about 50% since the 1980s. There's been enormous increases in prosperity. So we can make the argument that there haven't been any increases. It isn't true. We can say we can't measure it. Well, we really can measure it in many, many different ways. And what we also see is much more increase in the United States than we have seen in the most prosperous part of the world, Northern Europe. There's 4 times as much talent in Scandinavia per poor person, per low score, as there is in the United States. And the low scores in the United States earn more income than the low scores in Scandinavia.
Okay, Rutger, how do you account for that?
Well, for that, I mean, how do you define talent? I wouldn't use high scores or low scores to define talent. I think that's a pretty ridiculous measure, just as GDP is a ridiculous measure of wealth or welfare of the general population.
So is it just a question of what you measure then?
I think that for most people listening to this program, it's obviously clear that in many ways inequality has been growing, life expectancy is going down for a lot of people. We could do so much better with the extraordinary wealth that we have. And the very easy solution here is just to tax rich more and fund proper services with that. I mean, I hear a lot of words, I heard a lot of talk to get around that basic fact. But I think that for most people listening to that program, it has been quite unconvincing so far.
Yeah, but I'd say this, Europe tried that. Okay, they tried taxing and they tried redistributing. The United States, according to the OECD, spends 40% more on social services per capita than Northern Europe. If you look at healthcare, if you look at education, you look at any measure in social services, they try to measure it. We can just throw it out and say, oh, every measurement is preposterous, therefore I can say anything I want. I get that, but their attempt to measure it, and they just came out with a report not but a couple of weeks ago, it's substantially higher on a dollar basis, adjusted for purchasing power, which is the relevant way to do it. It's significantly higher in the United States than it is in the second richest place in the world. And that's a place with much more talent than the United States. We're getting way more value out of our talent, and that value is cascading down to the middle and working class. By value, I mean how much health care a person gets, how much education
how much
versus able to get, how much income they're able to get.
I mean, measured in what? All your measurements are so bizarre. I mean, the American healthcare system is the most expensive system in the world, and still life expectancy is declining for many people. You can say, oh, they're getting a lot of healthcare. Yeah, they're getting a lot of pills that they don't need. They're getting a lot of surgeries that only make them sicker. I mean, that is not how you define wealth.
Let Ed respond to that.
I think we know a couple of things. One is we can look at poor Mexicans who come across the border. Their life expectancy goes down. Why? They do start eating pizza, they start smoking cigarettes, they start drinking alcohol because they get rich enough to be able to do those things. And it's also the case that we did make a mistake in trying to soothe people's pain by giving them a lot of opioids that we will now correct going forward in the future. So what's really caused life expectancy to go down for the working class, people who have taken those medicines, there is one specific reason for that. But when we really look at healthcare and dig into those numbers, by and large, the United States is using a lot more health care. And when we look on almost any measure of prosperity, what do people do when they get richer? They spend more and more money on health care.
You define use of health care in terms of the amount of money people spend it on. So I live in Holland, and I pay around €100, which is, I don't know, about $120 a month for my healthcare, and I've got universal healthcare access to everything.
Yes.
A friend of mine just came back from New York, where he lived, and he had to pay literally 20 to 30 times as much. So sure, I mean, he purchases more healthcare, he gets more healthcare, defined in your terms like he spends more on it, but does he get more in the real world? Like, does he get better doctors? No, in many ways not. So again, you're using all kinds of definitions and measures that do not refer to reality as people experience it.
Let me ask you, Ed, you don't think an increase in taxes is the answer to dealing with inequality, but then what is?
I don't think the objective should be trying to reduce inequality. I think the objective is to get the highest possible standard of living for our middle class, our working class, and for the poor in the United States. And if we tax wealth, for example, or we tax inheritance, if we tax any income that would have been used for investment and redistribute it and consume it, we will get less investment, we will get less growth, we will get less standard of living. So what I would not do is raise the tax rates and lower the incentives for success.
Rutger.
Okay, well, a couple of things. We know from extraordinary social science research, for example, from people like Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, two researchers from the UK, who've looked at the social effects of inequality. And what they've shown is that on so many measures, you know, real-world measures, so not like productivity or whatever, but things like whether you talk about teenage pregnancies or crime or how well kids do in school or whether they are happy or whatever, just all kinds of social problems increase when you have higher equality. The correlation is overwhelming here. So that is one thing. You got to recognize that inequality is a social poison. The other thing is that it's all about protecting our democracies, right? So what you see right now in the US with people who are simply able to buy their way to the top. So I'm not sure who funds the American Enterprise Institute, right? I think there are a lot of threats to democracies when inequality starts increasing. And it's interesting, actually, if you now look at the poll numbers, there was actually a Fox News poll being done recently where they found that the vast majority of Americans is in favor of higher inheritance taxes for the rich, higher top marginal income taxes rates for the rich. So this is not about left versus right. It is about plutocracy versus democracy. And I mean, there are still a lot of people in think tanks who earn a lot of money by defending the undefensible.
And I think that was a bit of a veiled criticism there.
Well,
it wasn't veiled. It was.
Let me ask you, are you worried at all about the effects of inequality on democracy?
Well, I'm worried that inequality will lead to socialism, which will destroy capitalism and substantially reduce the standards of living for the middle class and working class. That's what I believe. Well, let
Ed make his point.
I think there are two systems.
The choice is not between capitalism and the gulags. Come on, travel around the world.
Let Ed make his point, please.
I believe there are two systems controlling the world, if you will, democracy and capitalism. Both of them are riddled with flaws. Churchill taught us that, democracy is the worst form of government except for all others. And that is because people will try to influence the government, the electorate's uninformed. There are many different reasons why it is riddled with problems. And similarly, capitalism, on the one hand, people are single-mindedly devoted to serving the needs of customers in order to outserve them relative to competitors. But yes, that's also the case that they're able to use their money to gain influence. What really matters is not, hey, what happens if the investors take over the government? It's a push and pull between two very powerful forces. And the question is whether or not investors are getting the upper hand. And from what I see, looking at President Obama's recovery, what we saw, for example, was a reduction in investor influence over democracy during the Obama administration. We got slowest recovery since the Great Depression. And what we saw is 8 years into the recovery, we're still seeing enormous gains in employment. We're still seeing large increases in investment. And we're seeing the stock market, for example, grew 30%. So it's not obvious where the balance is. If we go out to the extremes and talk about plutocracy and investors controlling government, I don't worry about investors controlling government because the vast majority of people are eager to tax the rich, are very concerned about the rich getting control of the government.
It's not happening. They've been saying this since the end of the 90s, if you look at polling data from Gallup. And still it's not happening. So I really think you should worry about the state of your democracy.
The assumption Ed has, your assumption essentially is that trickle-down economics works. Rutger disagrees.
Well, let me say this. I think that trickle-down is a very biased way to think about it. I think about it as trickle-up. What you want your talented people to do is create innovation and try to put $1 in their pocket. In order to do that, they have to put $5 or more in everybody else's pocket. And the reason they have to do that is if they don't do it, somebody else will. We have William Nordhaus, 2018 Nobel Prize winner, says that the innovators and the producers are capturing a minuscule amount of the value that they're creating and that virtually all that value is being captured by consumers. It's very difficult to argue if we say we can't measure anything, we don't have any data, I'm just going to give you my opinion, I'm just going to give you an anecdote about something that's bad in the world.
To be fair to Rutger, he did give you more than that. He didn't give you just an opinion.
I didn't hear it.
Well, you should start listening.
I think it's fair to say the gentleman did not agree. That was historian Rutger Bregman and Ed Conard of the conservative think tank in Washington, the American Enterprise Institute. Where do you stand in this debate over tax? You can get in touch via Twitter at BBC World Biz or at BBC Business or my own Twitter handle at Manuela BBC. That's it for now from this edition of Business Daily. We're back again at the same time tomorrow.